Okay, we are live. It looks like we've just got one or two people popping on. It has been extra couple minutes to get out here today. Our cat was being very theatrical. So it's been a week, and if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Do know that they take about 30 seconds to a couple minutes to come up. I'm not quite sure why. There's just a little bit of a delay. I have ordered a better webcam that was supposed to be here earlier this week, but it hasn't yet arrived. So hopefully this will be either our last or our second to last adventure with the camera in the poor position. So I have been out a lot this week. I've been registering voters and getting signatures and being at protests with, of course, appropriate social distancing and masks and gloves and sanitizers everywhere. And actually, I have to say that the folks who've been out in the streets very much have had safe and cautious behavior. They, by and large, had very few people without masks. Almost everyone's had a mask. I've had hand sanitizer out, and even people who aren't interested in registering to vote or signing petitions have been great about coming by and using hand sanitizer. People seem to be predominantly traveling in the groups that look like they're maybe their family groups or the people that they're living with, and keeping fairly good distance from others. So means, at least that I've seen, and I've been in Portland, although not every day in Portland, but Portland, Brunswick, Topsom, and Monmouth. I've been in all those this week, and everybody has been pretty darn good at social distancing. I'm a little bothered that at least two of the candidates in this race haven't even really acknowledged that there's so much unrest about this. And coincidentally, they are the same two candidates with legislative records, and the same two candidates that their legislative records don't reflect that they're really particularly interested in bail reform, in criminal justice reform, in changing anything about the way we have systemic violence towards the vulnerable in our system. And that's not great. So you have to wonder, the people who are quiet or silent on it, you know, they also are the people who want to be in office and aren't interested in doing anything about it. That bothers me. There are few issues that impact us more than systemic failures, you know, and almost all of the failures that we have aren't little failures, they're big failures, right? The failure to address climate change is a systemic, massive failure. The failure to address racism and injustice is a systemic, major failure. And when I was in Monmouth yesterday, you know, imploring people to register to vote, update their voter registration. The problem isn't that we have laws that necessarily on their face are objectively discriminatory. It's that the whole system is. And so there are a lot of things that don't necessarily look like they are super discriminatory, and maybe even seem like they're there for a good cause. So for example, bail. There are maybe some places where I can see a good case for bail. So for example, if you have somebody who just habitually doesn't feel like coming, they're a chronic failure to appear, and you use the bail costs to offset having to go fetch them for court, I think that's probably like a reasonable use of bail. But bail generally, as a rule, not an exception to that rule, is really oppressive. You are required to pay an amount, which is probably just enough for many people to make it so you don't have rent that month, or you can't feed your kids, or you don't have the transportation to get back to court. Because, you know, essentially what you're being threatened with is that amount of money will be gone from your life. But the problem is that amount of money is gone from your life in advance. And so you're having to deal with the consequences of that amount of money being given back. And if your behavior is good, you can have your own money back. It's almost like a prepaid credit card in the worst possible way. And so what ends up happening is very similar to what happens with, say, drinking and public charges, where It's not illegal to be drunk in public if you can afford to drink in a bar, but if you can't afford to drink in a bar, it's illegal. So you end up being punished for just not having the money in the first place. Bail is very similar to that. What ends up happening is you have people who they're like, well, we can't let you out on bail because you're homeless and we don't have a way to find you if you don't come back. Well, being homeless shouldn't be a reason to be retained in jail, or being asked for your last penny to be able to get out of jail. Saying that, $500 when all you have in your bank account is $300 is enough to make you really care about coming back. Well, how are you going to get the difference in that money? All it is enough to really destroy your life if you are at that point in time presumed innocent of any crimes. So we've got a lot of systemic failures in there. I'm going to pause for a second and just really quickly purchase domain. How would you change laws to address the racial disparities, which are issues? So the question that I have is about racial disparities at issue and how would I change the law? So two things. One thing that we can all be frustrated with, but I won't be in a position to fix, is a lot of the problems in the law are state law. There is some that is federal, and there are things that are federal do. I'm going to just briefly talk about state law, which is what I was talking about before, because it's what people are often more familiar with when it comes to crimes. A lot of crimes that people run up against are state law. So, we have somebody in this race who has been in the state legislature for closing in, I think, on 8 years, and I've been an attorney for closing in on 7 at this point in time, and I haven't seen any major reforms, and that I find that very frustrating. So on a state level, we definitely should be looking at how we do bail. And if you have somebody running for office who hasn't done anything about that, ask them why. You should know. They should be able to answer that question. That's important. I think that we have a lot of low-level charges that have a ton of disparity in them. And I've talked about this before. So really low-dollar thefts, we will put people in jail for less than $10. And often for a month or more. If they're a habitual offender, they become felonies. And, my argument with habitual offenders is if they're a habitual offender, that means so that whatever we're doing isn't working, and with the exception of somebody who's, say, a serial killer that is just truly unsafe to be out in the population, we need to be trying different mechanisms if putting people in jail is not what's working, because it's expensive for us. It doesn't fix the problem. Amy has added on a question about restorative justice. And I think, again, that's the most applicable on state level because a lot of the federal crimes aren't as appropriate to restorative justice. But I think that restorative justice has a place. What do we want to get? And this is one of the things we have to think about all of our systems, but criminal justice in particular, looking at our criminal code. What are we trying to achieve? When we have a consequence for an action, are we trying to punish people? I would argue that punishment most of the time doesn't achieve much because the person most of the time doesn't feel super bad about what they've done, or they wouldn't do it in the first place. A lot of crimes are either accidents, desperation, or addiction. Is our goal public safety and preventing that person from being out on the street? And I think sometimes the answer is yes. Again, if you have a serial killer, probably aren't exactly safe to be let out. But if our goal is to just have society function and to be in a place where we can be generally safe from worry and harm and not having other people harm us, I think that our goal maybe isn't punishment, and our goal maybe isn't retention or comeuppance. I think that our goal a lot of the time is how do we make this person be able to safely be in society? Do we have different mechanisms where we retrain people, where we give them social services and therapy, where maybe we just limit access? Maybe we have not necessarily jail, but maybe there's a more limited capacity. If some people perhaps should not be around children, they're just not safe around children, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're not functional around other adults. It's sort of sad that we pay more attention to the needs of, rehoming a dog sometimes, all the things, maybe this dog shouldn't be around children, maybe this dog can't be around other pets, maybe this dog has some special needs that require, medication or extra training or help, or, we spend a lot of time talking about finding a good fit for pets, and I think that's important. I'm not in any way downplaying that. I've fostered pets before, and I think that's really important to talk about the fit. But we don't really talk about having people who have a hard time fitting into society fit into society, and how do we make their experience and that of everybody around them safe and comfortable. So I think that we really need to reconfigure the criminal justice model. I think that we really need to look at it, particularly the crimes for which there is a disproportionately high penalty for a relatively minor harm or infraction. I think we've got a lot of administrative things that we have to handle. And, you're seeing, especially with things like COVID-19, where the harsh penalties often end up being a death sentence for something really minor. Prison or jail, that's not a very comfortable space. But there's also a lot of harm that can occur there. If there is a mass outbreak of disease, it is a very vulnerable place to be. And for somebody who's there, for chronic traffic tickets, is that the place we really want them? Is that how we really rectify that? You're going to see me looking kind of a little bit on the screen. And again, I apologize. My camera is ill-placed. State laws managed and guided. It makes sense that addressing state law. Yes, it's so a lot of it's state law, but some of it is federal. So I start with state law just because people are more familiar with it, right? Like, you're more likely to run into a legal problem with, say, an administrative infraction that you just have a hard time continuing to keep your license active because maybe you don't check your mail that well. And you've had inquiries from the state that you haven't responded to. That is a much more common thing than, say, getting caught up in drug trafficking. Most people don't have exposure to being a drug trafficker or, trafficking humans. Like, a lot of the interstate and federal crimes are at a level of criminality that most people just don't get trapped up in. It's possible for the average person to get trapped up in it, but exponentially less common. There's far fewer places where you can get caught up in those shenanigans. So on a federal level, there are things that we can do, though. There are mandatory minimums that kick in on silly crimes. There are 3 strikes you're out rules on certain types of crimes. A lot more of that is state level, but there are penalties that can be addressed, certainly. And I apologize, you're going to see my hand. I just realized an alert system is still on my computer, so I'm going to make that go away. So we can definitely reform criminal interaction on a federal level, and we can do things like make marijuana federally scheduled. That would take care of a huge amount of non-violent infractions. And society's changing about how we feel about marijuana. It's not the evil drug it once was, and it's not really any worse than alcohol. And that we have the freedom in this country to have vices. We're also missing out on a ton of tax dollars and opportunities for small communities, and particularly agricultural communities, as well as medicinal options. I mean, there's just so much R&D that can be done. There are so many benefits to letting communities, if they want to investigate that as a revenue stream or a tourism stream. And also it criminalizes things that are just silly to criminalize, frankly. But there's a lot of other things that we can do too. So to help states, we can push resources towards states to have them have the capacity. Maine, for example, has a part-time legislature. So it's very difficult for Maine, as much as I beat up Maine for not having addressed some of these things, we have a part-time legislature, and one would even argue a hobbyist legislature, because it just doesn't pay functionally that we have a professional legislature. It's around, give or take $1,000 a month. And, my mortgage is more than that. I most certainly couldn't afford to be a legislator. And it's part-time, but it's part-time in a way that makes it very difficult to have any sort of full-time job. Because even though it isn't in session all year round, when it is in session, it's something that would make it so you couldn't functionally do your other job. So it's part-time in the same way many part-time jobs are, where it really is your only job option. So, I think that we can push resources towards that. I think that's helpful, but I think there's other things that we could be doing to support it too. I mean, the federal government could be pushing resources towards changing policing models to more public safety models. The federal government could say, hey, we realize that though there is a both a correlation and a causation between social services availability and your police population. It's not immediate. There's a lag there, right? You need to provide services to people for a while before they can exit the criminal justice system if they're caught up in it. If somebody has mental health issues, even if it's a medication, there's usually a period of time to stabilize. So, if you're providing those services, which tend to be substantially more cost effective on a per person basis than putting people in jail, but there's a period of time and there's a transition, and state governments don't have the ability to print money the way federal governments do. So, we don't have the resources, I think, to do it swiftly in Maine. I think that it could be done much more swiftly if there were a federal infusion of cash to look at the models and say, hey, let's look at our prison population, who's really in there for being a violent repeat offender and maybe needs to be in there. And even maybe some of those people, there's mechanisms where jail might not be the best place. Let's look at what those are, and let's circle around and see what programs do we think could address this? What social supports do we think could address this? They're probably less expensive overall, but it's going to be more expensive at the beginning because you have to get those supports up and running. You have to have people trained. You have to have the system in place. And it takes several years to get that done. I mean, that is not a journey for the week to take. So, I think that there is some federal funding that can come. And I think there's federal funding for a lot of those supports that generally needs to be reconfigured. Simple things like time lab seems like it's a public education challenge. Time like is a public education challenge. And if you see me pop over, it's because I'm reading comments from you all. It is, but I think in more ways than you intended with that question. I think that we have to, get public buy-in on those alternatives, but we also need to put more into our public education system. I mean, the supports that are necessary start from birth for people. And that doesn't mean that that every person needs to be supported from birth from the federal government. That's going to be overkill. I think that not everybody in society needs that level of support. But, if we have children that from a young age struggle with school and being able to attend school and complete school, they're statistically much more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. When people are hungry, when people don't have health care, when people are poor, they are much more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system. And maybe there's a reason why with affluence, we tend to get just truly ludicrous and abusive crimes when people finally are caught for something, because a lot of the issues that we criminalize are very heavily related to poverty. So, a wealthy person crime is generally not the trivial crimes. It's, hey, I embezzled $20 million. I'm Bernie Madoff. You don't get the same low level crimes of people who are wealthy. So I think that on a federal level, though, we can be doing a lot with programs that we know have an excellent return on investment, and not just return on investment for dollar, but a return on investment in society. For example, food stamps or SNAP and TANF are some of the best return on investment dollars that we make. They stabilize families. They put money right back into the community. Every dollar that goes in is immediately spent. It's spent on social supports. We need to be looking at how we do handle the criminal justice system. And most of this, again, will be federal dollars going to the states to administer it. But putting somebody in jail is life destroying. Even sometimes for a weekend, it can be absolutely life destroying. And we need to stop destroying people's lives in advance of them being found guilty of a crime. Other things that we can do that I think people wouldn't necessarily see as an issue. So we, at least in the state of Maine, and certainly not federally, don't have a system where there's sliding fee government assistance for attorneys for anything other than crimes with the risk of jail. I think that we should probably be expanding that. I think that we should be expanding it where there's some sort of at least minimal representation, even if there's no risk of jail. I think a lot of people plead to things and plead guilty to things that have no risk of jail over and over and over until they come up with something with a risk of jail. But by then they have such a history of all these trivial things that they say, well, you've had all these run-ins with the law, and suddenly the hammer comes down for somebody who maybe has just like not been good with paperwork. So I think that's probably something that we could be doing. I think that also really disproportionately impacts people who are housing insecure, who are poor. I also think we should be applying that not just to criminal law, but I think that we should probably have some government assistance for legal help for civil and family processes. And as much as I, tend to work with PFAs where people who are the victims, a lot of the people who are accused of the behavior in PFAs, they should have access to counsel, because what they're dealing with is quasi-criminal and it's serious. And I think that I saw us doing that in Lewiston. We don't have it in Portland that I've seen recently or ever, where they have access to legal representation for both sides of those suits. So, but I think there's a lot of supports we can do with criminal justice, but also with the social support programs. And I think that those work more together than people give credit. I think that the idea that poor people are just lazy and unmotivated it's not true. Are there some people who are lazy and unmotivated? Yeah, at all socioeconomic levels there are, but I think that is by far the minority of our country. And we're legislating to this ideal of, preventing people from being lazy and unmotivated, but that's not a reality. So a lot of our law is based on really, really bad stereotypes that aren't even accurate stereotypes. And that's something that's pretty bothersome. I'm going to pause because I've got another question. What's it like for somebody to come out of the criminal justice system and back into society? I think it really depends on the person and the resources when they went in and how long they're in for. So, if somebody is thrown in jail, let's see, it seems like we need a big federal program, minor. Well, I think what we need is more legal representation. And I think that we need more people familiar with the system helping out. And it may not necessarily be attorneys. Maybe we have the equivalent of a paralegal that helps out, or case managers that help out. Part of the problem is people don't understand what they're getting into when they tussle with the law, and they end up creating criminal records, and then those grow exponentially. They end up with people who shouldn't be in jail. And people are jailed anyway when they shouldn't be in jail an awful lot of the time. And overnight in jail is usually not life-destroying for most people. In fact, sometimes it's life-saving if somebody is actively drunk and be engaging in unsafe behavior or with some other substance. I don't know that jail is necessarily where I would put them, but I think most communities don't have the financial capacity to have a separate detox or mental health facility. I mean, if you're out in rural Maine, they don't have like a choose your own adventure. Here's 20 different places you can go based on whatever's wrong with you in a town with a population of 300 people. They don't have those resources. And it's unrealistic to think those resources would ever exist in small towns, and perhaps even in larger cities. But I think what is realistic is saying, if somebody's going to be in jail for more than 24 hours, that's the real consequences start to happen at 24 hours. If almost any of us can get away with disappearing for life for one day, and unless, we're leaving children behind. But with each day, the harm is exponential. So even at 2 or 3 days, people start losing employment. People start losing access to their children. When you get closer to 30 days, people start, if their health insurance was not necessarily tied to a job, if their health insurance was tied to a job, they lose that with the job. If their health insurance is a Medicaid, Maine Care in Maine, then 30 days-ish is when they start losing that. They may lose eligibility for things like unemployment. As soon as the employment or the financial security piece is gone, you end up in a cascade of people losing cars and houses and not being able to feed themselves. So, once somebody has been in jail for more than 24 hours, you start to see those impacts just exponentially increase. So unless you're wealthy enough to have all your bills on auto pay out of an account with a huge amount of money that's just paying for your housing and paying for any vehicle payments you may have and paying for utilities and paying for all of those other necessary items, when you come out of jail, most people's lives are just devastated. And that is, there is not a good transition plan back. There's not a lot of help back at all. We have a few programs in Maine that are starting to address that, but they are extremely financially strapped. And nationally, there just really isn't a model for that. So I think where we need big government, I don't think that we need to be setting policy often at a high level. I think that it gets too unapproachable. It's very hard to hold people accountable to federal law. Federal law has to do with a lot of things that are either budgetary or things that we just can't handle as well as a state. So a lot of environmental policy, for example, or military, it would be very difficult for all 50 states to have their own military. And so I think that the administration of some of these high level things still should be at state level or lower. You still need to be able to be in contact with your citizens. You still need to be able to talk to people and see how are things working and how can they adapt. Federal law is slow. It is not a fast law most of the time. And I think that we saw that with things like the stimulus payment, which I don't particularly agree with. I think that reoccurring payment would have been a much wiser choice for us to have, although that's not the direction that we took. But, excuse me, I have a spoon in my hand and no place to put it. I was going to take a sip of tea. I think that, we need to be able to be responsive with that stimulus payment. It took months, right? They passed it. I just got mine and it came to the wrong name. and I just got it very recently. So, that's months and months and months after it passed. I was fortunate to have the financial resources and, my credit to be able to handle that gap. A lot of people didn't. There's a lot of people who don't have anything right now. And our unemployment system is quite broken here. And that's something that at this point in time, you can blame on both Republicans and Democrats. I think that it's really popular to say, oh, LePage screwed it up. And yeah, LePage's system kind of sucked, but LePage hasn't been governor for a while. And if we knew that was happening, then it's the people in office right now. It's their job to fix it. So I think that, I think you hear a lot of big government, small government, and I think that we're looking at it wrong. I think the answer is local government as much as possible, but there are some things that either all the states are failing at catastrophically, or there just aren't their financial resources in most states. So I think of the federal government's role should be changing and evolving to something that isn't necessarily big government, taking us over Big Brother, but instead it should be big government sees that there are struggling communities and steps in and offers to be a support while that community gets up to speed. But I think that really sort of encapsulates my view generally of the rule of government. I grew up in a Republican household, and it pains me to hear a lot of Republicans saying, well, if you can work, you don't need help. Because, the way that I was raised is not necessarily you should give people everything. It's you should work, but you need to take away the barriers to being successful. And I think maybe once upon a time there was a big chunk of the Republican Party that felt that way. I don't know that it's there as much now, and I don't know that they picked up that theory in the Democratic Party where I want people to be as individually successful as they can, but sometimes that requires giving a boost now and then. And some people will need that help indefinitely, and it's going to be at all different levels. And it's, it's not that different from how the schools are starting to switch to IEPs with children. Like, not every child learns the same way. And to get out of school, some children need different accommodations. So I think that we need, a huge percent, 60, 70% of people won't really need much help at all from the federal government in their lifetime. They just won't. They're able to do it on their own. They're not coming necessarily from hugely disadvantaged backgrounds. They might need a temporary support here and there. But then there's going to be a not insubstantial chunk of our population that is going to need help a little bit more frequently. And that might be, hey, we know you're not working. We know there's no jobs in your area. We're not going to put a requirement for work on food stamps because it's just not enough money to survive on. It's enough to not go hungry. Food stamps are not generous. I think there's this very strange perception of people on food stamps running around with, lobster and steak and being lazy and not doing anything. Most of my clients who get food stamps get maybe $300 a month, $200 a month. It's not that much. And I think the national average is right around $100 a month is the help that people get. And that's just enough to make it so if you had no food, you could eat rice. What we give is not generous. So same thing with medical care. I think that we need to have a lot more access to medical care and access where people can actually use it. A lot of our criminal justice problems are caused either by undiagnosed mental illness or people call the police when what they really need is a de-escalation team for mental health. And you may see the cat bouncing up right there. So if you see a flying cat, I apologize, or maybe I don't apologize. Maybe that's the plucky comic relief you needed today. A lot of times, and I have this happen all the time in family law, people are afraid to call the police for help because they call the police for help, and what happens is the police come, and it's not a de-escalation. And so, we see stories about this happening all the time, where someone who has a mental health problem ends up getting shot or harmed or have that criminalized when what they're really having is a mental health episode. And I don't think our police are well trained to handle that. And I don't think it's their job to handle it, right? I think that we maybe need to have either much broader training or different teams that are sent out. It is a very different situation to be handling somebody who is sort of like indiscriminately going house to house and shooting versus somebody who is having a mental health decompensation. We had an event here in Maine not too long ago where there was a gentleman who was having some pretty massive mental health issues. And he actually ended up surviving this, but the police ended up blowing up his house. Like, I don't think blowing up somebody's house is necessarily a functional method of handling a mental health issue. And it's a wonder he survived that. So I think the police are often put in a very difficult position. It is hard when you are trying to be the adult in charge of a situation to remain calm. And, I think that if you haven't been a police officer, and I most certainly haven't, I have friends who are and have been, and I think it's both culturally difficult to change your mindset. And I also think it's situationally difficult to say, hey, I need to take my own safety sort of out of this and say, what can I do to make this, what can I do to make this a more safe situation? I think that it's pretty common in the type of person who's interested in that job to say, I told you to do this, you're not doing this, I'm going to make you do this. And we're seeing that at a lot of the protests. I'm going to make you do what I want you to do. And I am empowered and emboldened by the law to do that. And, that's because a very small portion of time they have to, right? Again, if there's somebody going house to house shooting, you need to subdue that person. They're doing immense harm. But I think it's hard to turn that mode off. So I think we probably need to have better training for law enforcement officers. I also think we, again, need to have different teams. I think it's unrealistic to repeatedly train somebody to deal for a crisis situation that involves shooting back when that's truly the minority. I mean, the minority of times that you're in a situation as a law enforcement officer that you would have to be on that trigger alert. And I think it's much more common that the response that is necessary is a de-escalation. But I think that we train them for the worst case scenario. We don't train them for the most likely scenario as much. And if we can't manage that training in a way that keeps law enforcement officers and the people they're trying to keep the peace for safe, then maybe we need to have different teams. Maybe we need to have, when there's protests, and maybe that's not law enforcement officers, maybe that we have a peacekeeping force that does it and they're unarmed. I don't know what the answer to that is. I do know we need to start a national conversation about it, but unfortunately we are trying to hit about 80 different sized pegs into a round hole, and most of them don't fit. We are asking law enforcement to conduct a lot of things that they shouldn't. We are asking law enforcement to put themselves in situations where they have to be trained for risk all the time. Hold on, I'm reading a note that was, but system needs to be something more like law enforcement, hospital, temporary assistant, back on street, law enforcement. Yeah, and I agree. That's what maybe what we need is a series of very specialized people that are doing what the law enforcement officers are now, but it's a much smaller force that handles that. And then, we need people who function more like case managers or social workers. And we're going to need to throw some financial resources at this. And we're probably going to have to try a few models, and not every model is going to work. But what we're doing now doesn't work. So to keep doing what doesn't work, so the comment was the collective chain of the system is essentially shrugging. And I think that's true. I think that we see this happen in politics, and to take it in a related, sort of non-related place. I was talking to somebody yesterday about how, the way we elect people to office, for example, isn't that much different than the way we police. The way we elect people to office is we've got the way we've been doing it, and it's kind of grown to this just deeply dysfunctional place where the people doing the job are maybe not the people we want doing the job, right? Like, there are an awful lot of people in law enforcement who are fabulous, and there's an awful lot of people in law enforcement who are domestic abusers, and they really kind of get a kick out of the power, and maybe they're not the right people to have there. So I think the same applies to a lot of politicians we have. Like, there are people in the race I'm in, I don't really know why they're running. They don't seem passionately committed to any particular thing or anything that they want to change that they really, really, really need. So there was a comment about law enforcement also needs mental health support. And I think that's part of the system. Our law enforcement, our social workers, our DHHS workers are really burdened with this. They are exposed to constant trauma and violence all the time. And I think that a lot of them themselves are in a hyper-reactive state. I mean, I can imagine that being in a crowd as a law enforcement officer, being on the crowd side, being on the protester side, and going, why are you in riot gear? This is ridiculous. Nobody's attacking you. But, they're trained for the what if, and they've seen situations where people do attack them. So we have a ton of trauma in our system. We deliver a lot of comeuppance to people who don't deserve quite as much comeuppance as they get. And we do not have a system that is designed to get people functioning in society. And it's from the base up. I mean, the laws aren't designed for a productive society. The laws were designed more on what sounds good than what works. So one of the things I say a lot as a divorce attorney is, you can express what you want to express, or you can get what you want. And sometimes, you have to emotionally step back to get the result you want in family law, right? To peacefully co-parent, sometimes you have to emotionally step back and, maybe you want comeuppance for cheating or whatever broke your family, but that's not going to change that the family's broken, and you need a way to move forward. You need to be able to co-parent, because just because your relationship didn't work out doesn't mean that you don't have to survive with that person for an extended period of time, and work with them long-term in close quarters. And I think that the same can be said of criminal justice. just because you had an incident where you did something stupid, or you drank too much, or you don't know why you grabbed a chapstick that wasn't yours and didn't pay for it, the consequences shouldn't be so disproportionate that you can't ever go to a grocery store again, or that you can't ever go out to dinner again, or you lose your whole family. These people have to integrate back into lives. And right now, our system is just not set up for that. It is not set up to have people integrate back into life, and it's set to pull people away from their lives that shouldn't be pulled away from it in the first part. We have our system of innocent until proven guilty only applies if you're wealthy, and that's not okay. I don't know the solution. I do know that we have people in office and running for office that don't even want to look at those solutions, or haven't previously looked at those solutions in their legislative past. I do know that it's going to take being willing to change the system and try new things. I do know some of those things won't work. The process of change requires trying some things that inevitably won't be what you need. But I do know we also need to change. We can't just keep doubling down and tripling down on strategies and systems and people that don't function. It's not going to work for any of us. So we need to change our laws. We need to hire people that are going to change the laws. We have to change the system supports, which is done by law. And I think that as much pressure as there is for a cultural shift, it's not going to happen until we put people in office that change the underlying structure, and the structure is law. The law is the scaffolding that our society is built upon. And if we do not have a good scaffolding, it doesn't matter what you put on top of it. It's just going to crumble. If we don't have that structure in place, if we don't have that base in place, everything's going to collapse no matter what we put on it. So, I just implore people, whether it's me or somebody else, if you find yourself supporting a candidate that agrees with you less and makes less sense than someone else that you could be supporting, switch your support. Because what ends up happening is we have people that want to go with the most viable, but most viable is it's bought by money. I mean, our system continues to perpetuate without fixing these problems because it's profitable to be here, right? Jails are profitable. Having systemic oppression and racism's profitable. Systemic oppression is profitable. There are people who make gobs of money off of our system being broken, and they spend an awful lot of money back to make sure it stays broken. So I feel like I'm going in a circle on this one. It's been a very emotionally charged week. The protests are they are meaningful. They are change if we are able to keep them in a sustained way. It is a way to vote your heart. And a lot of people, particularly in voting systems that aren't ranked choice, don't vote their heart. And because we aren't voting with our hearts, and because we aren't voting for the things that we really think we need for change, we're voting for marginally better. We're getting we're getting bad law. We're getting bad legislators. We're getting, systems where, to some extent, I don't fault a lot of our police officers for their responses, not because they don't need to have accountability, but they are placed into a system where it is impossible to get accountability. Yeah, they are culturally placed into a system where, we don't hear people speak up against coworkers and who make poor choices. We know the poor choices are being made because they're filmed. We haven't gotten more racist or more crummy. We've just gotten more cameras. So we know these things are happening. We know that there's way more happening that's not captured on camera. And we know that people don't speak up, and they're probably not speaking up because either there's not a mechanism or there's a culture there that doesn't permit it, or both. I have heard some horrifying stories in the past week or so that I wish I had a way to make public of what I've heard of some of the culture, but because I'm an attorney, I have a different role. And so I can't necessarily just disclose everything that people tell me, but we definitely need to be changing our systems, because I don't think we're going to get a different police force. I don't think we're going to get different laws. We have to pay attention to who we vote for. We have to pay attention to our system. And I guess my thoughts today would be register to vote, get involved, and support the right candidates. Stop looking at the money, because the money is not put there by the right people. Start looking at, how do we get change? If somebody's legislative record, if they have one, doesn't support change, don't vote for them. Don't support them. Don't give them a penny. Start looking for people who are very interested in changing the system, and look for people who are willing to change the system to something that is just healthy. We don't want people to say, we'll never have police officers again. Do we need to change their role? Sure, yeah. But we're going to need some mechanism. There is an element of society that does need restraint, right? There are violent people that will just always be violent, and there is going to need to be that. There do need to be consequences for some activities. Those consequences just probably shouldn't be what they are. Look for people who want to look at the system and say, it's not always all or nothing. We can't have criminalized everything. We can't have criminalized nothing. We need to look for that balance. So look for people who are compassionate, who are kind, who recognize that there are systemic failures, that those systemic failures need to change. I see that, community policing is needing. We need people who are engaged with the community. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. We need to really examine what our criminal justice system is. Are we trying to have healthy communities, or are we just setting penalties for stuff and enforcing it? And I think right now we've got a system that really just has penalties. You could not have people policing communities they are not for. Yeah, I think that that loops back to some of the restorative justice things. I think that it is, and that actually is an excellent argument for smaller government, and the role of government being changed, where maybe the federal government, we start looking at more as our pocketbook and our support, than maybe necessarily making and setting all of the policy. I think maybe that we should be looking at them as setting the supports. There certainly are things they'll have to control, like, global environmental policy probably needs to be handled a lot at a higher level, and like, again, military, although our military is over militarized. But the more local we can make these solutions, I think the better solutions we're going to get. And that's going to require infusions of cash, because most communities, particularly the small communities that really do want to work on this and have healthy communities, they just don't have the cash to reconfigure these programs. If you've taken a criminal justice model that's the equivalent of McDonald's and rolled it out and franchised it throughout the country, it's very difficult to reconfigure one McDonald's, right? You almost need that infrastructure support to come with resources from the top. So I think that our policies should be bottom up, and I think that our financial supports and structural supports should be top down. So we should be listening to the bottom for the policy. We should be pushing up resources to the bottom to the top, as far as, making sure that cash gets back where it needs to, into local communities, into helping people who are poor and disenfranchised. And then, we have people who are at the top that should be listening to those less advantaged places and say, what do you need? How can we support you? And that's just not how we've been making laws. What can we do in Maine to address unemployment? Call the freaking state legislature and the governor. The system is broken, and it was broken a few years ago. But, good gravy, the response is not awesome. I appreciate that our state legislature is part-time. I appreciate that our governor has a heck of a lot on her plate right now, but good God, they need to be doing more. They just, our state legislature did a little bit at the beginning of the pandemic, and then they just pieced out. Like, where are they? This is a pandemic. This is definitely a time to be calling emergency sessions, and things have changed so much since the beginning of the pandemic, but the legislature didn't come back and address any of it. A lot of those supports do need to come from the federal government. Our state government doesn't have the ability to put in a temporary UBI. That needs to be done federal level. But I mean, the amount to which our state legislature has abdicated any responsibility for any of the systems that have problems is sort of astonishing to me. I have had that opinion whether for a while, not just on this crisis. And that is a consequence of a part-time legislature. That is a consequence of a not professional legislature, is you have people where this is their hobby or their second job, and maybe they're very passionate about it. But I mean, our state's in a massive crisis, and the state legislature hasn't readjourned, which again, to me, is just shocking and a true disappointment of leadership. Like, if you cannot reconvene even digitally your legislature and in a time of emergency where the governor, who I have some real problems with the way this is being handled too, is obviously at capacity, and you're not providing those supports, that is just astonishing. So the state legislature is going to have a lot of work to do. They are going to be limited by budget. We're going to need federal help. Maine is not going to be able to survive this financially without some federal infusions. And that is part of why it is so incredibly important to send not just somebody who's not Susan Collins, but send somebody who is going to pay attention and do something. You can't just elect not the person you don't like for a crisis like this. You can't manage it. I mean, that just can't be our standards. So, send out people to DC that are engaged and that are willing to handle this crisis, because the states, Maine in particular, we're going to need a lot of help. And we need people that are not afraid to tackle controversial issues. We were supposed to get maybe another $1,200 right away. And, I wouldn't hold my breath over that or any meaningful support from the current Senate. So are there any other questions before I check out and talk for a sec, just to make sure none pop up? I'll drink a sip of my tea. They're working on adapting education for fall. On a state level, yeah, but it's almost district by district. There is sort of a state policy, but it's really district driven. I got a survey that asked me a whole bunch of my preferences for the school district. And though I appreciate the question, the week on, week off school sounds like sheer hell to me. They were asking about AM, PM. They were asking about limiting classes. Let civics back in. I think that we need to be changing our stuff entirely. I mean, we are planning in our household that we may have to be schooling at home the whole next academic year. I don't know how we're going to juggle that. It's very difficult when you have working parents, but very few places people can afford not have a working parent or two working parents most of the time these days. So I think that it is being handled on a level that's much lower than federal. I'm not entirely confident most schools will be back in the fall, certainly not how we're used to. I think that our federal Department of Education, should be doing better, but we've got somebody there who just doesn't actually care about education. So, and that's another reason why it's so important to send the right people to DC, because we have people running agencies that just shouldn't at all. You even if it's your party, you can't blind vote for people. You can't just agree with most people that are there, or let people out of committee that are truly unqualified just to protest a vote later. Like, we've got to stop doing that. We've got to stop all of the politicking and just make it about doing what's good And there can be variation on what good is, but that's just not what's happening in DC right now. So let's send somebody down there who is willing to tell others when something's full of BS. Novel idea. I agree. I feel like a couple of the people chatting, I have gotten the opportunity to know through the campaign, and we could probably sit here and talk for like 3 hours about these issues. But most people watching are probably not going to want to watch us be upset about a senator holding the government accountable, and they should be. We really should be hiring people who are accountable. I will be back on Tuesday evening, most likely, and see you all then. If you have any questions, you can always find me on Twitter at Tiffany Bond. I'm not there as often as it looks like I am. It's really easy on Twitter to look like you're there a lot more than you really are, but I do try to be generally accessible. I usually try to answer anything I see within a day or so. If you don't get an answer, you can always send me a message through my website. And I hope you all have a great rest of your weekend. If you are going out and protesting at all today, please stay safe, practice social distancing, make sure you have a mask, make sure you have hand sanitizer, and let's see what we can change.